author of 7 books and numerous articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education, social welfare and civil rights in post-9/11 America. Her widely acclaimed biography, The Rebellious Life of Miss Rosa Parks, won a 2014 NAACP Image Award and the Letitia Woods Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians. It appeared on the New York Times bestseller list and was named one of the 25 best academic titles of 2013 by Choice. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, The Nation, Slate, Atlanta, all fake news. Her new book, I do want to just mention too, she is a graduate of Harvard and the University of Michigan. I say that because I know there's a lot of Michigan transplants in the audience and some who went to the University of Michigan, and so she is a Wolverine as well. So her book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, came out in January from the Beacon Press. So please welcome Professor Jeanne Theoharis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. And the music, what a lovely way to start today. So thank you so much for that, that music. So 2 summers ago, as protests mounted across the country following the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, then Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed celebrated Atlanta as the home of Martin Luther King. But to explain the large police presence at downtown demonstrations said, Dr. King would never take a highway. 3 years ago, former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee instructed Ferguson protesters to be more like Martin Luther King. CNN's Wolf Blitzer wished for Martin Luther King in Baltimore following protests around the killing of Freddie Gray. And Reverend Barbara Reynolds took to the pages of the Washington Post to tell Black Lives Matter activists they should learn from the civil rights movement, and I quote her, "We were nonviolent activists who won hearts by conveying respectability and changed laws by delivering a message of love and unity." Across the political spectrum over the past 4 years, as sort of Black Lives Matter has kind of galvanized national attention, commentators across the political spectrum have invoked the history of the civil rights movement to chastise and correct Black Lives Matter, casting today's protesters as too angry, too reckless, too unrespectable, and not living up to the peaceful, respectable, unified legacy of the civil rights movement, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that many of these same critiques were leveled at the civil rights movement. These framings, in fact, misrepresent both the movements that Black Lives Matter activists are building across the country, and they greatly distort the history of the civil rights movement, trafficking in a national fable, I would argue, that distorts and obscures many aspects of the movement. So my new book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, and I should say, it is, I was talking to a couple of people before, and it is on Kindle, but it's also on Audible. And so I think many of us now, the busy lives we lead, it's sometimes easier to listen to books. And so we made sure that it was also on Audible. So my new book seeks to both examine and analyze the creation of this national fable, a fable that has become increasingly central to the way the United States defines itself, both at home and abroad. Just one small detail, when President Trump went to meet with the Pope, he took first edition writings of Martin Luther King as the present from the United States to Pope Francis. So and we can talk about how Obama and Clinton and Bush, right across the political spectrum, the civil rights movement has become one of the kind of shining examples of kind of the power of American democracy. And this is sort of where the book begins, like part of my goal was to kind of think about the creation of this national fable and to kind of analyze its uses and misuses and to identify its kind of distortions and omissions. So the fable tells a story, a powerful story of a Southern movement galvanized by Rosa Parks led by Martin Luther King and peopled by courageous Southern Black people with the help of Northern white liberals, journalists, and the federal government, who struggled and ultimately succeeded in passing two landmark pieces of legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It is a tale filled with good guys, bad guys, and a happy ending, a powerful story of individual grit and the power and strength of American exceptionalism. The story crosses partisan lines and really began to gain ascendancy as a kind of national story when President Ronald Reagan's long opposition to a federal holiday for Martin Luther King changed in 1983, and the Reagan administration began to see the political utility in supporting a federal holiday. And on November 2nd, 1983, Reagan signed the legislation. And I quote from him: "Now our nation has decided to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by setting aside a day each year to remember him and the just cause he stood for. We've made historic strides since Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. As a democratic people, we can take pride in the knowledge that we Americans recognized a grave injustice and took action to correct it. And we should remember that in far too many countries, people like Dr. King never have the opportunity to speak out at all." Reagan's remarks zeroed in on what would soon become key elements in this national fable of the civil rights movement: that there had been an injustice, but once these courageous individuals freely pointed it out, it was corrected, and so proved the greatness of American democracy. Now, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks are key linchpins of this fable, honored and trotted out over and over as sort of proof of our national progress, and often as a way to paper over current injustice. I would argue they have been turned into Thanksgiving Day parade balloons: jolly, larger than life, unthreatening, bobbing along, proud of our progress. So I began this book, and I began the introduction sort of examining the political uses of the development of this fable. National histories, and many people have written about this, give us as Americans and give countries ways to make sense of themselves in the present. This national history of the civil rights movement does a number of things. I think it justifies both action and inaction. So racism and struggle are placed in the past, but it's also sort of a cleansing, and I think we can see that in the kind of comments around Black Lives Matter. We would have been part of a great movement like Martin Luther King's, but this one is too reckless, too fly-by-night, too leaderless, right? All the different criticisms. So we don't need to feel like we need to do this now, but we feel good because we would have been part of this thing then. Second, I think they give us national identity, right? Look at how great our democracy is. In many ways, America is sort of a self-cleaning oven, right? We just are like constantly cleaning ourselves. Obviously, those of us who know how self-cleaning ovens work, they just incinerate everything inside. Third, I think they put the civil rights movement on a pedestal. Prissy, unreachable, and it makes it hard to imagine being like somebody like Dr. King. Fourth, I think it also makes it seem like somehow it just happens. Rosa Parks sits down and somehow people rise up. And so I think it makes it hard to imagine how we do it today. So again, the beginning of the book kind of looks at the creation of this fable, and then the heart of the book looks at 9, what I argue are gaps, omissions, distortions that the fable kind of promotes, and what a fuller history looks like, what a fuller history gives us. And I'm going to talk about maybe 4 of them today, and then we can have questions and conversation. So first, I think the fable southernizes the civil rights struggle. And I just got back, I was in Montgomery a few weeks ago, and you can't go to Montgomery without seeing markers to the civil rights movement, right? To Rosa Parks, to King, to the Montgomery bus boycott, to the freedom rides. But I think most of us would be hard pressed to find a marker to the New York City civil rights movement, even though there was a massive struggle around schools, housing, jobs, policing right here. Like their Southern counterparts, New Yorkers, black New Yorkers, and their sort of white allies, Puerto Ricans, rejoiced with Brown versus Board, thinking this would mean change in New York City schools. They did all sorts of things, right? Ella Baker, many people know Ella Baker, right? Although we often associate her with the Southern movement, Ella Baker is based in New York for her whole adult life and is running the Harlem NAACP when Brown is passed. And they begin to organize to try to make Brown come home to New York City schools. They do all sorts of things. There's a huge protest outside City Hall in 1957, trying to quiet Baker, and also Kenneth Clark, right? Kenneth Clark's research, along with Mamie Clark, is used in the Brown decision. Kenneth Clark is speaking out vociferously against New York City school segregation. In response, New York City schools sort of take a different tact after Brown is passed. They celebrate the decision, but they say, you know, I don't think this applies necessarily to us. And so the thing we should do is start a committee. Let's have a committee to study whether there's anything we have to do. And they put Baker and Clark actually on parts of that committee in many ways to try to silence them. That committee actually comes back with many recommendations, the two kind of most important being the need to rezone, right? How New York City schools are segregated is because the way the state draws school zoning lines to protect segregated schools. And so the committee comes back and says, well, the first thing to do is to rezone. In many places, kids wouldn't have to travel farther to school if you drew the lines differently. The second big thing they talked about was teacher placement, that if you looked at where teachers got placed, by and large, the most permanent teachers, the most seasoned teachers were placed in schools educating white children, and schools educating black and Puerto Rican children tended to have more substitutes, less permanent teachers. And so the commission also called for sort of changes in teacher placement. The Board of Ed basically responded, we're not going to do any of that. So you see a growing school desegregation movement in New York City, right, at the same time as we associate kind of the movements in the South, right, building throughout the early 60s. And in fact, the largest civil rights protest of the 1960s is not the March on Washington in August of 1963. It takes place right here in New York City in February of 1964, which is kind of after a decade of trying to get the Board of Ed to make a plan for desegregation. Basically, they organize a one-day school boycott, and nearly 500,000 students and teachers stay out of school to protest the fact that we are 10 years after Brown and there is no comprehensive school desegregation plan in New York City. Why don't we know this? Right? Why don't we commemorate it? And I think part of that, and this is a kind of the second kind of aspect of the fable that I think is troubling, is the way that we picture who stood in the way of the civil rights movement, who opposed the civil rights movement. And I think when we say that, we tend to think of people like Bull Connor, right, the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama. We think of Strom Thurmond, right? We think of George Wallace, right? Segregation now and forever. We don't tend to think of Superintendent Jansen. He's the superintendent when Brown is passed here in New York City, and Jansen instructs sort of school personnel to not use that word segregation. Don't use that word. He says use separation. And I think there's strategicness in that, right? He's both trying to make it seem like whatever's happening here, even if the schools look segregated, that's just separated. We tend to also not think about the role of the media, because again, in the narrative we have of the civil rights movement, right, the media is crucial to sort of how that Southern movement comes to sort of gain national attention, because a number of very courageous reporters go south to expose what's happening in the South. And that's undeniably true. But the papers they work for the networks they work for do not show the same kind of courage, do not show the same kind of steadfastness in looking at their own hometowns. So the New York Times, for instance, right? If you look at how the New York Times is covering the movement around school desegregation in Birmingham in 1963, the coverage is deep, it is wide, it is critical. You look at how the New York Times is covering the movement for school desegregation here in New York City, and just to give you some examples, in the lead up to the February 1964 school boycott, the New York Times calls it reckless, calls it unreasonable, calls it unjustified, and calls it violent. We're 10 years after Brown. Unjustified. Violent, right? There's nothing violent about students and teachers staying out of school. It's disruptive, right? And so again, you see the ways that disruptive protest often gets cast as violent even when there's no violence there. A month after the February 1964 school boycott, a group of white parents, mostly white mothers, are worried, given how massive this was, that the Board of Ed might begin to take seriously, right, a need for a comprehensive plan, in part because the board has proposed a very modest school pairing program where a couple dozen schools are going to be paired together, right, to start to begin to desegregate. And these mothers, these white mothers, won't have any, don't want it. And so 15,000, mostly white mothers, march over the Brooklyn Bridge to protest this school pairings program in March of 1964. They get massive coverage on TV, in the newspapers. And that coverage, right, and that somewhat sympathetic coverage will affect the structure of the Civil Rights Act, right? So this is the spring where the Civil Rights Act is being debated. And you will see kind of Emanuel Sellers, one of the New York City congressmen, a number of the sort of sponsors of the Civil Rights Act will introduce a loophole into the Civil Rights Act. One of the things the Civil Rights Act is going to do, right, is it's going to tie federal funding for schools to school desegregation. But Northerners, like these New York City congressmen, start to get worried that that could actually come home to their schools. And so they introduce a loophole in Title IV, Section 401B. This is where they're going to define desegregation. So it defines it as desegregation means the assignment of students to public schools and within such schools without regard to their race, color, religion, or national origin. Now here's the loophole. But desegregation shall not mean the assignment of students to public schools in order to overcome racial imbalance. Now racial imbalance is the other word that northern school officials like to use about their schools. They're racially imbalanced. They're not segregated, right, because that has some sort of legal connotation. So that loophole will allow school districts like Chicago, like Boston, like New York, to keep their federal funding, right, and to justify the maintaining of sort of segregated schools. And I often ask my students a trick question, which is, when did New York City schools comprehensively desegregate? And the answer would be never. They're never forced to. So again, the second thing I sort of try to get us to think about in the book is kind of who opposed the Civil Rights Movement. What did it look like? And I think it's much broader, right? And it's not just the people who are spitting, who are burning crosses, although certainly that's one form of opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. It's not the only form. And indeed, most Americans did not support the Civil Rights Movement while it was happening. In May 1961, Gallup surveyed Americans, and only 22% of Americans approved of what the Freedom Riders were doing. 57% of Americans said that sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom buses, and other demonstrations were hurting Black people's chances of being integrated in the South. Okay? So overwhelmingly, Americans are not in favor of these supposed, the tactics that the Civil Rights Movement is using. Now, lest we see this as Southerners skewing this national sample, in 1964, this is a year before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the New York Times polls New Yorkers, and a majority of white people in New York City said the Civil Rights Movement had already gone too far. And I'm quoting the New York Times. While denying any deep-seated prejudice, a large number of those questioned used the same terms to express their feelings. They spoke of Negroes receiving, quote, everything on a silver platter, and of reverse discrimination against whites. So again, this language that I think sometimes we associate with how people sort of oppose things today is already sort of well established 50, 60 years ago as a way to kind of discredit, right, the civil rights movement. Now, I call the book A More Beautiful and Terrible History, and after this quote of James Baldwin, and I love that they put it in the program today, right? Baldwin writes in a talk to Baldwin actually not writes. He gives this incredible talk to teachers. If you've never read it in its entirety, you can find it online. It's really beautiful. And Baldwin says, American history is longer, larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. And I, kind of played with this sentence, in part because I think when we're forced to grapple with a kind of fuller history of the civil rights movement, it is more sobering, it is more terrible. Both sort of, we don't come out looking so great. We see the kind of enduring problems of racial injustice in schools and housing and jobs and policing. We can see that there was progress, but some of that progress has been eroded, and then other areas that the civil rights movement was very much fighting around, including things like criminal justice and economic justice, right? Those were not won, and they still have to be won. But the other thing that I think this history gives us is it's more beautiful. It's more inspiring. It's more powerful. I think the more we learn, the more I think it gives us to sustain us today. And part of that, I think, is about the kind of tremendous variety of leaders, the tremendous variety of people who pushed it forward, right? And so I actually have a whole chapter that's about the role of high school students. Because I think that we often get so nervous today about kind of the ways that high school students or young people, right, that they're not going to do it right, and both that those fears were there at the time, right, but also kind of the central role high school students play, and I'll tell you just two stories. The first is Brown versus Board, right? Brown versus Board is actually a composite of 5 cases, and my favorite case comes out of Prince Edward County, Virginia, and it's started by a high school student, a 16-year-old high school student named Barbara Johns. She goes to Moton High School, and some of her friends are working after school at the white high school across town, and they see how different the facility there is. And they come back to talk about it, and Barbara Johns is dismayed and angry, and so she organizes her classmates to go on strike, right, to demand sort of like an equal high school to this white high school across town. And they call the NAACP for help. And the NAACP doesn't want help. They're like, this is not the place, this white resistance here is too formidable, and so they send 2 lawyers down basically to try to get the kids to stop. And these kids are so not stopping that they manage to win over the NAACP, and the NAACP, with the approval of their parents, decide to pursue this case, right, as a kind of one of the cases that they're pursuing around the need for full school desegregation. But it started by, again, one of the cases that will lead to the Supreme Court's sort of decision in Brown is really put forward by high school students and high school students who didn't take no, right, when these kind of lawyers come down to be like, this is not the time or place for this. And they're like, well, it is the time or place for this. The second is what happens with the Montgomery bus boycott, right? So the Montgomery bus boycott is a 381-day bus boycott. But one of the things is that we have Rosa Parks' case, but one of the things that activists in Montgomery know, and this is people like Parks, who's been active for more than a decade before she makes her stand on the bus, E.D. Nixon, who's a union activist, they've all been working on these issues for a long time, and one of the things that they're worried about is they've actually had cases around bus segregation, and what the state did was they tied those cases up in state court. So 3 months into the bus boycott, they decide to file proactively into federal court. And they need plaintiffs. And Rosa Parks, they decide Rosa Parks is not going to be a plaintiff, in part because she has a case in state court and they don't want it thrown out on kind of procedural grounds. And they also, I think, are nervous about Rosa Parks because Rosa Parks has this whole huge history of activism, including with the NAACP. And at the time, the NAACP is being red-baited. And in fact, by June of 1956 in Alabama, the NAACP will be outlawed. So they don't want it, Rosa Parks is not going to be a plaintiff on that case. They want one of the ministers to be a plaintiff. No minister is willing to do it. So that case goes forward through the leadership of 4 women, 2 of whom are teenagers. One of whom is Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin, 9 months before Rosa Parks makes her stand on the bus, Claudette Colvin refuses to give up her seat on the bus. She's 15 years old. And she's arrested. She's manhandled by police as they're taking her off the bus. She sort of resists. The second person, about 6 months later, Mary Louise Smith, she's 18. She also refuses to give up her seat on the bus. So 2 of the people courageous enough to be willing to be on this federal case, and it is this federal case that will make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's what then leads to the desegregation of Montgomery buses, are teenagers. And so I think seeing the kind of courageous role that teenagers are playing, seeing the ways that high school students often lead forward and pull adults with them, right, I think gives us a lot, and when we're thinking about who's leading us today, and how we imagine, right, our role vis-a-vis those young people, right? So the need for middle-aged people, older people, to kind of make space for that leadership and to understand that that the kind of trepidation people sometimes feel is like the trepidation that people felt 50, 60 years ago, but that in fact it is those young people that oftentimes blaze the trail.